He saw total reality as being one thing, didn't he? One substance, of which all apparently different objects, and indeed people like ourselves, are merely facets, merely modes, merely aspects. This is a very difficult idea, I think, for most people to grasp at a first meeting. Can you unpack it a bit for us?
Well, probably the best place to begin is, again, I promise I won't go on doing this, with Descartes, because Descartes defined substance, and the idea of substance in philosophy is a name for what it is that really exists, what the real components of the world are. Descartes defined substance as that which requires nothing but itself in order to exist. And in terms of his view of things, the only true substance, therefore, was God, because everything that existed apart from God, and he thought that consisted of human souls and material objects, including the human body, everything apart from God was dependent on God for its existence. So its substantiality, its title to being substance, was a little defective. God was the only absolute substance, but from that point onward, he didn't draw any further attention to it. Now, you could see Spinoza as taking that point of Descartes really seriously and saying, no, there truly is only one substance, only one thing which, to use a free translation of his own essential phrase for it, is the explanation of itself. Only one thing whose essence explains its existence, whose nature it is to exist. And his conclusion was that the only thing of which that is true is the totality of what there is, absolutely everything. And the one vaguely commonsensical element in Spinoza is to say absolutely everything, the totality, the one substance, is in fact nature as well as God.
Another argument that he used for that derived from from God's infinite nature, didn't it? That if God was infinite, there isn't anything that isn't God. Or to put the same argument the other way around, if the world is separate from God, then God has boundaries, God has limits. God is finite and not infinite. For God to be infinite, he must be coextensive with everything.
That, I think, is probably as plausible a way as you could find of arguing for Spinoza's position, and it has anticipations in earlier philosophy. He goes through a good many other arguments to establish his general point. But what it really amounts to is there's only one thing whose explanation lies within itself. For everything else, its explanation lies somewhere outside it. And the odd thing is that this one thing, all right, so to one extent, from one point of view, it's nature, the totality of what there is in space. But on the other hand, it's God. It's something, broadly speaking, mental. Now, and he says God or nature is the true name of the one substance.
Now, there's a big step, isn't there, at least for us, and I'm sure there must have been for him and his contemporaries too, between seeing the whole of reality as being a unity, which is one idea, and then seeing that unity as being divine, or as being God. That seems a quite different step to take in the argument. What were his grounds for doing that?
Well, I suppose it was essentially God's perfection, that nature wasn't treated as some passive byproduct of God's activity, but nature was the totality of what there was, the self-explanatory thing, and so to that extent was a perfect entity, the most perfect thing there could be, and therefore deserved the name God. The only God, if you like, he was prepared to countenance was a God that was identified with the whole array of natural things.
So summing up Spinoza's vision, which was the very good word you used for it just now, he was saying in effect that if we call the totality of everything there is nature, then we can say in our terminology that there is no supernatural or supranatural realm, and also that God cannot be outside nature. God must be coextensive with the totality of what there is if God is infinite.
That seems perfectly reasonable.
Now, this would seem to solve one of indeed the most notoriously unsolved problem left by Descartes, which was the problem of how mind and matter interact with each other. Descartes' work posed that problem, but didn't really provide an acceptable solution to it. Spinoza is now in a position to say, well, the problem doesn't really arise, because, in fact, everything is a different aspect of the one. the one thing which is everything.
Certainly the two things you mentioned, which constituted a special problem for Descartes, which he had a bold and highly unsatisfactory solution for, mind and body, these are brought together in an ingenious fashion by Spinoza, and it could be seen, as it often has been seen by historians of philosophy, that we should best understand Spinoza as coping with that problem of Descartes. But I think that's rather a limited conception of what Spinoza is up to. He's after a bigger game than that, a proper total conception of things. What he says is, in developing this thought that the one substance is infinite, he says not only does it contain everything and have nothing lying outside it, which is an idea close to, if not identical with, the idea of infinity, but that God or nature, the single substance, the one substance, the totality of what there is, has an infinity of attributes. Now, this sounds a little puzzling, and it is puzzling, because as it turns out, only two of these attributes are in any way accessible or intelligible to us. The others have to be taken on faith that it has the rest of them. But the two we know are the attributes of thought or consciousness on the one hand, the attribute of extension on the other. And what Spinoza maintains is that every wrinkle in the total fabric of the one substance, these wrinkles he calls modes, and that is the proper understanding of what we think of as self-subsistent things, tables, chairs, our wife's family, whatever it might be, various identifiable items that have clear, definite contours. For Spinoza, they're just temporary contours taken on by the fabric of everything that there is.
Like waves in the sea.
Each of these is at once conscious and extended. And so there are the phases or aspects or wrinkles, as I call them, of reality are at one and the same time have these two aspects, a mental aspect and a physical aspect. Therefore, there isn't a question of two utterly separated things happening to keep where, in some cases, in time with one another, to chime in with one another. They are one and the same thing viewed from two directions.
Now, we've both made much of the fact that Spinoza presents his philosophy as if it were Euclidean geometry or on the lines of Euclidean geometry. Now, with a system that is set out deductively, in which everything follows from everything else, there simply isn't any room for free will, is there? What was Spinoza's attitude to the whole free will question or the whole free will problem?
Well, I think that can be put very clearly in a couple of sentences to start with. What he does maintain is that what he would probably call the everyday, vulgar, commonsensical notion of freedom, that is to say, the idea that the human individual can sometimes act as a spontaneous, uncaused cause of things, the freedom of pure spontaneity, this, he says, is impossible. It's simply an illusion that's engendered by our not knowing what the causes of our actions are. But on the other hand, this is the other sentence, Spinoza says there is such a thing as human servitude or bondage, and that consists in being induced to act by some causes rather than others. There are some causes, we can call them, generally speaking, the passive emotions, things like hatred and anger and so forth, generated in us by the frustrating influence of the world outside us, the parts of the world, I'd better say, that are outside us. And he also believes that we have active emotions, which are those generated by an understanding of our circumstances in the world, a knowledge of what's going on. And the greater our activities are caused by active emotions and the less by passive emotions, the less in bondage we are, because we are more ourselves.
I think he was probably the first person in European thought to introduce this very important idea, which in a quite different form is made much of a great deal later by Freud and by psychoanalysis, that discovering what the hidden sources of your actions and emotions are will be, in a sense, liberating, will make you happier, even if it doesn't literally increase your freedom.
I think you're right. I mean, you could see Spinoza's attitude to man's position in the world as a stoic one, the idea that the world around us is not particularly interested in us, therefore we must diminish its power to make us suffer by controlling the emotions it excites in us. That's a Stoic idea, but you're quite right in saying there's something more in Spinoza, because it's not the idea of, by a terrific effort, repressing or overcoming these sad, unfortunate, passive emotions. It's by the exercise of the mind, gaining an understanding of the world which just makes these emotions peter out or fade away, and their place come to be occupied by the active emotions, the most elevated of which, as he describes it, is what he calls the intellectual love of God, which is a rather mysterious business. It's the emotion that attends a metaphysical understanding, a total comprehensive understanding of the world.